Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of our podcast where the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary blurs. Imagine waking up on a slow Saturday morning, brewing your coffee, and going about your usual routine, only to stumble upon something so bizarre, so unexplainable, that it changes your life in ways you never imagined. That's exactly what happened to Joe. One moment, he's brushing his teeth. The next, he's face to face with a slimy, misshapen creature flopping on his bathroom floor. Where did it come from? How did it get there? And why did this seemingly harmless discovery lead to a locked door, a vet in shock, and police sirens rushing to the scene? Joe, a regular guy going about his morning routine, was taken aback when he discovered a strange, misshapen creature flopping next to his toilet. Convinced it was a bizarre fish that had somehow ended up in his bathroom, he rushed it to the vet for examination. But when the vet heard his story and took a look at the creature, his eyes widened, and he uttered the words, "This is impossible." Joe was surprised by the vet's reaction, but he had no idea that things were only going to get even worse. Before he knew it, the vet was on the phone with the police, urging the officer to come to his clinic as soon as possible. Minutes later, Joe found himself alone in the vet's examination room, where he had been told to wait until the police arrived. When he tried to open the door, he realized that it was locked. He started banging on the door, yelling for someone to open it for him, but the vet only replied, "No, I can't let you leave." Joe was stunned. He could hear the police sirens getting closer in the distance. All he could think about was getting out of this room, or else this could end very badly for him. But what was so special about that creature Joe had found? What was it, and why did the police need to get involved? It was a slow Saturday morning for Joe. He hadn't even set an alarm, and when he woke up, it was almost noon. He opened the curtains and went straight to the kitchen to turn on the coffee machine. This was perfect. His coffee would be done and waiting for him by the time he was in the bathroom, and it would have cooled off just enough so that he could drink it straight away. Joe took the time to wash his face and brush his teeth. I should shave today, he thought, as he patted his face dry with a towel. Then he turned around to use the toilet. He sat down, finished his business, and flushed it. However, while he was washing his hands, he heard a strange sound like something wet had fallen onto the floor. He assumed that it was just a noise that his toilet randomly made. It was quite old and had been in the house since he bought it, so he didn't even turn around to check it out and proceeded to wash his hands. It took him a few moments to realize that the noise hadn't stopped yet, and he thought that perhaps his toilet was broken. Joe finally turned around, confused and wanting to have a look at the toilet. When he saw that strange creature lying on his bathroom floor, he exclaimed, "Whoa! What the heck is that?" Joe jumped back away from the thing. He couldn't believe his eyes. After moments of disbelief, Joe sprinted to grab the largest bucket he could find. Using a towel, he pushed the creature into the bucket, filled it with water, and watched as it calmed down. It was a bizarre, fish-like blob, slimy, ugly, and unlike anything he'd ever seen. Mostly white with pinkish spots, it had visible eyes and a mouth. Joe couldn't fathom where it had come from, though the toilet seemed a possible source. Bewildered, he took several photos, hoping they'd help identify the creature later. Placing the bucket in his bathtub, Joe ensured it had enough water to survive. Despite searching online and sharing photos on forums and social media, no one could identify the strange fish. He was left with nothing but wild guesses. Out of options, Joe decided to take the creature to a vet. He secured the bucket with a lid, placed it in the car, and drove cautiously to prevent water from spilling. However, it was the weekend, and many clinics were closed or fully booked. After numerous calls, a curious vet, Dr. Simmons, agreed to see him. Joe arrived at the clinic, relieved that the fish had survived the journey. Carefully lifting the bucket, he entered the busy reception area. After explaining his situation to the receptionist, he was asked to wait. Seated in the waiting room, Joe ignored curious glances from other visitors as he kept his focus on the peculiar fish in the bucket. The sight of dogs, cats, and birds reminded him just how unusual his discovery was. It wasn't long before Dr. Simmons called Joe's name. Feeling the weight of others' stares, Joe followed the vet into the examination room, carrying the bucket with care. The professional atmosphere of the room gave Joe some reassurance. He placed the bucket on the examination table as instructed, anticipation building as he awaited answers. When Dr. Simmons looked into the bucket, his reaction was immediate. His eyes widened in shock and he gasped. For a moment, he appeared lost for words, clearly struggling to comprehend the sight of the strange fish. Joe anxiously watched as Dr. Simmons stared at the strange fish in disbelief. The vet's initial shock gave way to questions. "Where did you find it? And how had it ended up near your toilet?" Joe explained the bizarre discovery, but his answers offered no clarity. Dr. Simmons seemed to be forming a theory, though he remained tight-lipped. To Joe's surprise, Dr. Simmons suddenly called the police, speaking in urgent, hushed tones about proof. Joe's confusion grew. What could possibly warrant police involvement? When Joe pressed for an explanation, Dr. Simmons apologized but refused to elaborate. The situation escalated further when Dr. Simmons left the room and locked the door behind him. Realizing he was trapped, Joe's panic set in. He shouted for help, but Dr. Simmons only called back that Joe needed to wait for the police. Desperation pushed Joe to attempt breaking the lock, but his efforts were futile. Exhausted, he sat down, resigned to waiting, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Finally, the police arrived. A stern officer entered the room, adding a new layer of gravity to the already surreal situation. Joe recounted the entire story, but the officer's skeptical expression made it clear he wasn't buying it. Joe struggled to explain the truth, feeling the weight of disbelief pressing down on him. After finishing his story, Joe was told he could leave. However, the officer took his address and phone number, stating they might contact him after examining the fish. The vague promise left Joe feeling uneasy as he exited the clinic. Returning home offered no comfort. If anything, the quiet deepened the surreal nature of the day's events. Seeking some semblance of normalcy, Joe called his friends to share the bizarre story. Their reactions mirrored his own: shock, disbelief, and growing concern, especially when Joe mentioned police involvement. What had started as an inexplicable discovery spiraled into something far beyond anyone's expectations, leaving Joe and his friends questioning what would happen next. Later that evening, Joe's friend Mark appeared at his door, visibly worried. His unexpected visit brought a mix of comfort and apprehension. Mark apologized profusely and confessed, "We never thought it would be something so serious." Joe, sensing an important revelation, braced himself as Mark asked him to step outside. The cool evening air was heavy with tension as Mark led Joe toward a nearby forest. The familiar path felt eerie under the weight of Mark's silence, but Joe followed, hoping for answers. They stopped by a river where Mark finally revealed the truth. He and their friends had found the fish in the river and decided to prank Joe by placing it in his toilet. The absurdity of the prank hit Joe hard. He was initially angry, but soon grew curious about why such a joke had escalated to involve the police. Though relieved to have some answers, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Joe immediately called the officer, explaining that the fish had come from the river and was part of a prank by his friends. To Joe's surprise, the officer took the news seriously and asked both him and Mark to come to the station. The urgency in the officer's tone left no room for hesitation. The drive to the police station was tense, filled with unspoken questions. As Joe and Mark arrived and stepped inside, the seriousness of the situation became apparent. The strict demeanor of the officers reinforced the gravity of the investigation. Joe and Mark, who had been joking and at ease with each other only hours ago, now faced the reality of their actions. At the station, the officers interrogated both men thoroughly. Joe recounted his story again, while Mark explained how he and their friends had found the fish in the river and devised the prank. Their explanation seemed to satisfy the officers initially, but the discussion soon took a more serious turn. A team of officers had been dispatched to the river to investigate the source of the fish and conduct tests on the water. The officers' diligence suggested there was something peculiar about the creature that went far beyond a harmless prank. Meanwhile, Joe and Mark were eventually allowed to leave the station after their statements were recorded. The relief of being let go was palpable, yet it was tinged with unease. As they walked out into the night, the weight of the day's events lingered, leaving them to ponder the unforeseen consequences of what had started as a simple joke. The next day, the results of the police tests came back. Alarmingly, the findings prompted the officers to return to the river for a more thorough investigation. This time, the operation was extensive, with law enforcement combing through the surrounding area, determined to uncover any clues that could explain the fish's origin. After hours of searching, they stumbled upon a shocking discovery: a hidden illegal animal testing laboratory concealed within the dense foliage near the riverbank. The lab, though crudely set up, was fully operational. Inside, law enforcement officers found a disturbing array of equipment and evidence of animal testing. The lab workers, caught off guard by the raid, were quickly detained. Among the various animals present in the lab, they found traces of wildlife that had been illegally trafficked from different parts of the world. The blobfish that Joe had discovered turned out to be one such victim. A species native to the deep waters near Australia, the blobfish had been illegally imported by the lab's operators for experimental purposes. The revelation shed light on the origins of the creature and highlighted the seriousness of the prank, which had inadvertently involved an endangered species. The raid on the lab marked a significant breakthrough for law enforcement and the local community. The lab's operations were permanently shut down, and the workers were charged with multiple crimes, including wildlife trafficking and illegal experimentation. For Joe, the entire ordeal felt surreal. What had started with a bizarre find in his bathroom had snowballed into a criminal investigation and the uncovering of an underground operation. The story quickly caught the attention of the media, making Joe an unlikely local celebrity. News outlets covered the bizarre sequence of events, from Joe's initial discovery to the police raid on the lab. Reporters flocked to Joe for interviews, eager to hear his perspective. Though hesitant at first, Joe eventually embraced the opportunity to share his story. Joe recounted the tale from the unexpected discovery in his toilet to the uncovering of the illegal lab. With each retelling, he became more comfortable in the spotlight, using his newfound platform to spread awareness about wildlife conservation and the consequences of seemingly harmless pranks. Joe decided he would prank his friends back one day, but he would make sure it was a joke they would never forget, without the legal drama. The blobfish was transported back to Australia, where it was released into its natural habitat. Conservationists carefully managed the transfer to ensure the fish's safety throughout the journey. Once in Australia, the blobfish was reintroduced to the deep sea, its peculiar appearance once again becoming part of the underwater world. The successful release was a small but meaningful victory for wildlife conservation, celebrated by all who had followed Joe's story.